She's traveling from the western part of the state. And before I introduce Dr. Potee, I just wanted to let you know that we had Dr. Potee here last year in the spring, and some of you may have been here, and a lot of people commented about hearing great things about her or seeing some of it on local cable access, and wanted to actually have an opportunity to hear it again. So we reached out to Dr. Potee, and she agreed to come. She doesn't usually speak on Tuesdays. She's a full-time family practitioner out in the western part of the state, and she specializes she's done a lot of research on addiction, and it's certainly an opportunity for us to, as a community, take a look at the issues of addiction and what our kids are dealing with. Just so you know, and first let me introduce myself. I apologize. My name is Wes Paul. I'm the principal here. And today we had 1,200 of our students, perhaps some of your children, here in the auditorium for a very lively presentation in which we talked a great deal about marijuana, and certainly knowing adolescence and knowing society and the issue at hand. There was a great deal of conversation, but it was a conversation, and it was good. Despite some of the students feeling uncomfortable about the chatter, and perhaps came to me and certainly came to Ruth and apologized for the chatter, I think the opportunity for our students to actually engage in a conversation and hear the truth about the medical side of addiction and the opportunities that we have. I'm going to let Ruth kind of share with us all a little bit about what she talked about and some helpful takeaways. I'd also like to thank some people who are here this evening, certainly all of you, but Dr. Keogh and Dr. Cabral, who are superintendent, assistant superintendent, are tremendous supporters of all the efforts we do in school, trying to educate our students and certainly the community on the issues of addiction. And it's certainly near and dear to a lot of people in this community based on the tragedies that we've seen in the last decade with the opioid crisis. So with that being said, Dr. Potee asked me to keep it short. That's probably too long. But please welcome Dr. Potee to our school and for this presentation this evening.
Thanks to Principal Paul and to Lynn LeBlanc and the other school nurses who brought me here. I said to them, I do one school a year. And I love this school. I was so warmly received in the spring, and they asked me to come back and speak to the kids. And I said, I see patients all day. I have to cancel patients to do that. I have other jobs. I can't do it. But I love this school. And I thought, I'll dive back in and do one. And I arrived today with a whole auditorium. And I will talk to 20,000 of you guys anytime, including students. Love having students. But a giant auditorium full of students is terrifying if you're not a principal or a superintendent or a teacher. So it was a lively conversation. And we're going to dive in a little bit on marijuana ourselves tonight. I'm going to show you some of what I showed to the kids. They had a different talk than this, though. It was a little briefer, and we talked mainly about how the teenage brain develops. But we're going to dive in. We're going to talk about addiction in a big picture way. So the first thing I'm going to say is, for those of you who have seen me speak, I'm not going to lie, I have a lot of overlap with my other talks. It's not like I create a new talk every time I go out. What I give is, I update my slides. So if you've heard it before, try to get one new nugget out of it tonight, and I apologize if you've seen it before. My hope is that many people here have not seen me speak. So we're going to talk about the reward circuit of the brain, which is the part of the brain that tells you to survive. It tells you to find food, find water, spread your genetic material forward. It's the most ancient elemental part of the brain. It has three areas: the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex. I like this little slide because it sort of has a little comedy, but really it's eat, drink, have sex. And the problem with it is the part of the brain that is impacted with all addiction. And here I have this very profound survival part of the brain that is the one that is damaged with addiction. And if we could pick up the disease of addiction and put it in the visual cortex or in the hearing auditory canal, and you just lost your peripheral vision when you got addicted to something, addiction would be a really easy disease to take care of, right? And instead, the thing that tells you I must do this in order to live is the thing that is disrupted with addiction. We're going to spend zero time talking about serotonin. Serotonin is one of the neurotransmitters that impacts mood and thinking and sleep. We're going to spend all of our time talking about dopamine. And dopamine is this neurotransmitter in the brain that gives you this great sense of joy and euphoria. It makes you feel fabulous. It has with it strongly associated fine motor skills, which is one of the reasons people will say, what I really miss is I miss opening the bottle up. I miss getting the works ready when I was injecting. They miss the fine motor part of the addiction as much as they miss the actual drug itself. This part of the brain that dopamine interacts with has two behaviors associated with it: compulsion and perseveration. And if you think about your ancestors, they were compulsive about finding food and water. It was the last thing they thought about before they went to bed. It was the first thing you thought about in the morning. They had to perseverate on it in order to survive. And all of these empty chairs here are ancestors that didn't do a good job with compulsion and perseveration. Your ancestors were good at those behaviors. That's a great thing, right? The problem is when you take those two behaviors and you assign them to the disease of addiction. For those of us in the medical field, anybody work in the ER, in a hospital setting? Nurses, anybody? You do, right? So this behavior, the compulsion, the perseveration, you're like, man, I just saw you last week. Can't you get yourself together? It is part of the behavior that defines the disease, are these two behaviors. So some of us on this planet are just lucky. We have high dopamine levels. So here I am describing that this neurotransmitter gives you this sense of joy. And I'm going to make an argument tonight that on average, we sit at a dopamine level of about 100. Now, you can't call your primary care doctor tomorrow and have them test your blood level for dopamine. It's not a serum measurable marker. But if we're all sitting at 100, some of us are glass half full, happy-go-lucky people. We see the good in everything, and maybe our dopamines are 106. A lot of other people's dopamines sit at a baseline lower than that. They're sort of the Eeyores of the world, right? They're glass half empty, nothing looks good to them, they're sad. They come to the doctor a lot. My office is filled with dopamine levels sitting at 85 because those people have lots of needs. For those of us in the medical field, people who go to the school nurse's office, maybe dopamine levels are a little low. The way that it works, though, with dopamine in the brain, if we're all sitting at 100 and you find that perfect food, that June strawberry or that lovely August peach, you get a spike in your dopamine, and your dopamine will go to 150 because your brain is saying, this is a great thing, I need to return to this again. Then your dopamine comes back to 100, which is normal. You have sex, it's consensual, you have an orgasm, your dopamine spikes to 200. It is supposed to be that way. This part of the brain, its job is to live long enough to send your genetic material forward. That is what it does. When you use a drug like cocaine, your dopamine will spike to 350. When you use a drug like a strong prescription opiate, or actually injectable opiates like heroin, your dopamine will spike between 500 and 900. And when you use a drug like crystal methamphetamine, your dopamine will spike to 12 to 1300. So those are some enormously elevated dopamine levels. And you sort of wonder, well, why the heck aren't we all going off and using crystal meth tonight? Because that seems like a great idea. There's an answer to that, okay? And here it goes. So I'm going to talk specifically about two drugs and how they work. But everything that has to do with the dopamine in the brain has to do with three parts of an equation. How much dopamine is produced, how many dopamine receptors are sitting on the other side receiving the information, and how many little vacuums there are sucking the dopamine out of the synaptic cleft. You get to influence those three things. The way that cocaine works is the simplest pathway. It turns off the vacuums. So there's no vacuum sitting there sucking out the dopamine. That's how you get a dopamine level of 350. The way that opiates work is much more complicated because it goes through a negative feedback loop and then a positive feedback loop, but at the end of the day, it just makes more dopamine and pushes more dopamine out. Every addictive pathway, whether it is to nicotine or to video gaming or to gambling, eventually ends up interacting with the dopamine system. Somebody asked me to describe the video gaming pathway, and I was like, whoa, that's way above my pay level. I have no idea. In fact, in 20 years, maybe we'll know that pathway. I am a believer that the screen can be very addictive for a lot of us. We can't help ourselves. We have to keep turning, even though we know it's getting in the way of other things that need to be happening, right? Compulsive use, continued use despite harm. That's the definition, or part of the definition of addiction. So here you have somebody who finds that perfect peach, their dopamine spikes, it goes back to normal. The problem is that when the brain sees levels of dopamine of 350 or 1200, it says, holy smokes, something is wrong. I should never be having a dopamine spike that high. It's too high a volume. I'm going to down-regulate. I'm going to turn it down. I'm going to stop making dopamine. I'm going to erase 80% of my dopamine receptors, and I'm going to create many more vacuums. People's new baseline dopamine isn't 100 anymore, right? They're sitting, their new baseline, when they've entered into an addictive pattern, their new dopamine level's 40. It's hard to get out of bed with a dopamine of 40. It's hard to pour a bowl of cereal for your kids. It's hard to be nice to your colleagues. It's hard to be nice to my office staff, right? It is hard to function. People continue the cycle of drinking or using drugs because they're desperate to feel normal again. And when they use, they get their dopamine back up to 80 or 100. I tell you, they're chasing that high. People will say this to you. I use drugs, one, because I'm going to get sick, and I'm trying to prevent the withdrawal. But because if I don't use the drug, I will never feel normal. I'm just trying to get back to my normal level of function. So it leads to this concept of a brain that gets broken. This part of the brain, the most elemental, ancient part of the brain, becomes damaged in a specific way. And I use this image not because I think people have brain damage, it's because it's to remind me, to say to you, that brains get better. People heal from addiction. What helps people heal from addiction is time. Time and distance away from the drug or the substance. That's what helps people heal. And although I'm not going to dive into all of the treatment, and question and answer, I'm happy to talk about treatment, but I'm going to say 5 to 7 to 10 days in detox does very little to zero to heal the brain. This takes years to get better. It's a long time away from the drug that heals. So somebody in Easton, a little lovely couple down the street, a guy was having crushing substernal chest pain, and his wife knew that was a bad sign. So she called 911, and the ambulance arrived, and they hooked him up to an EKG, and they gave him some sublingual nitroglycerin and a beta blocker, and they put in an IV to give him some morphine, and they transmitted the EKG to the Good Sam ER. They saw it right away, and they actually looked at that and said, holy smokes, this guy's having a massive MI. This guy needs quintuple bypass, not something we're going to do here. We're going to med flight him. Or you could take him in the truck if you want to, straight to the Brigham. That's where he belongs. He gets there, he gets quintuple bypass in the operating room. He's in the cardiac care unit for 4 or 5 days. He has time spent maybe a week or so on the floor. He gets a social work consult because he's going to get depressed. He has an outpatient follow-up appointment with me. He gets a new cardiologist. He gets to have a psychiatrist. He started on an antidepressant. He goes to cardiac rehab because he's going to need cardiac rehab. How much money we just spend on that guy? Definitely a lot. I don't know, a couple $100,000, right? Oh, I put him in the Brigham. Whoops, the Brigham. That may have been $500,000. Okay, so this young woman is their next door neighbor, and she's 24 years old, and she struggles with an opiate use disorder. Her mom knows this about her. Her mom has Narcan at home. Mom knocks on the bathroom door. There's no response. She breaks the door down because she's a frantic mom. She calls 911. Which is always the first thing you do. She administers Narcan. Her daughter's not arousable. The 911 comes, they administer Narcan too. They administer it 3 more times. By the time she gets to Good Sam, she's on a Narcan drip. Heroin's gotten really powerful. Most of it's laced with fentanyl right now, and most of the overdose deaths are fentanyl. We're using Narcan 3 or 4 times just to get people breathing again, so we're entered into this new horrible next level phase of this disease. What happens to her at the Good Sam ER? So, wow, so that is somebody who actually does know that this is a young woman who took a long time to revive, and so maybe she was vent dependent in chronic care versus they decided to remove support. I should have said she actually came alive in the truck and was wild and mad and had acute vomiting and diarrhea. So she woke up, she did not need a vent. What did we give to her at the hospital?
More drugs.
Possibly. A lot of people actually leave somehow, there's settings where they leave the ER somehow with opiates when they have an opiate overdose, which makes no sense.
A lot of time in the ER.
She hung out in the ER. If she was willing to hang out, she may have run, right? She may have been out the door. The best ERs out there might hand you a brochure and say, here's some numbers. You got to call them 24/7, and good luck to you, right? Bye-bye. Booted to the curb. So let's talk about this guy, right? He's 68 years old. He's a 2-pack-a-day smoker. He has uncontrolled high blood pressure and diabetes. I know this because I'm his primary care doctor, and he hasn't seen me in 2 years. He goes to McDonald's 4 times a week. Both of his parents died in their 50s of heart attacks. So here's a guy who is 100% set up for what happened to him. In fact, he created his disease. 100% he created his disease. The #1 killer in this country is smoking. Did I tell you he was a 12-pack a day? He's kicked back a 12-pack of beer every day too. So the #3 killer is alcohol. So here I have a guy who created this disease. And did anybody stop him at Good Sam and wag their finger and say, you know what, my friend? You actually caused your heart attack to happen by making terrible lifestyle choices and becoming addicted to nicotine and alcohol. You made this happen, so I'm actually not going to provide your care today, right? You can have a baby aspirin and some supportive care and kick you to the curb. Did anybody do that? No. We treated him the way we would treat anybody except for people with addiction in this country, which is that we acknowledged you're sick, regardless of how you got there, and we gave you the care that you needed. Yet we do not do this with people who are struggling with addiction. Ever. Rarely. Including alcohol. For those of us who have had alcoholics in our family, if you're struggling with alcohol, the ER is not a very pleasant place to be. For those of us who've had that struggle. And I'm telling you, the care we provide people who struggle with the disease of addiction, whether it's in primary care or in the emergency room, is really appalling. And if you want to judge people and wag your finger at people, then spread it out equally, my friends, right? Start judging everybody you know who has bad health style decisions, carries excess weight, who does things in spite of the fact that they have genetic history of early heart disease or diabetes, right? I would be the worst doctor on earth if I looked at all my patients and said, you need to be a vegan and you need to run 50 miles a week. If you're not doing that, I'm not providing your care, right? Because that is, we don't do that in medicine. We meet people where they are and try to provide them the care they need. Okay, so let's go back to dopamine in the brain. So I talked about dopamine earlier, and I just want to show you what the PET scan. So I said you can't measure dopamine, but PET scans have a way of lighting up dopamine. You look at that middle column, that is a normal, healthy brain, and you can see that orange lineup is dopamine. Nice, normal, healthy brains, plenty of dopamine. And when you go to the right column brain, that top brain is somebody using cocaine, the next one down is somebody using meth, the third one down is somebody using alcohol, and the final one is somebody who uses heroin. And so there's not a lot of dopamine on that far column. I do want to point out alcohol, which is there's still quite a bit of dopamine with alcohol. The wheels come off the alcohol bus pretty late in the game, right? It takes a while before your husband walks out and you lose your job and you get your 3rd OUI. It takes a while, and partly because it's the GABA system that gets interrupted a little earlier than the dopamine, but it's one of these very understated disease processes amongst us. Alcohol has a huge impact on families and on society and on individuals, and I will not underplay that. In fact, we're going to dive in on alcohol tonight. So there's 3 plus 4 things that predispose an individual to the disease of addiction. The first one is genetics, the second is early use, and the third one is trauma. Poor mental health is a component of all of those things. Sometimes one begets the other, right? Having a history of childhood trauma will lead to poor mental health. Somebody may use drugs or alcohol early because their anxiety is so high and they think using a drug will quiet their anxiety. So the mental health becomes a component of the story, but when I talk about it, I don't spend as much time focusing in. So the genetics of addiction are some of the strongest genetics of all diseases out there. And people spend a lot of time when I'm sitting in the office with them telling me about their genetic risk for heart disease or for cancer, and I'm not going to minimize them except to say to you that the genetics on those diseases aren't particularly powerful. The #1 cause, again, of heart disease is smoking, right? That has nothing to do with genetics. But with addiction, the genetics are really powerful. So if you have a parent or a grandparent who suffers with addiction, you have a 50% chance of suffering with addiction yourself. So who needs to hear that? Your kids need to hear that. And I told your kids that if they go to this school between the ages of 9th and 12th grade today. And I think I said, your parents should tell you about the disease of addiction in your family because you deserve to know that and you don't get to control for that one. You get what you get, but you get to control for other things in this lineup. So this is the thing our kids get to control, and that is the first exposure they have to an addictive substance. So all addiction starts while the brain is still developing. And the brain is actively developing up until the age of 24, 25, maybe for some people as late as 26. A tremendous amount of important things happen during that 12 years between the ages of 12 and 24. And that's what I talked to the kids about today. We talked about brain development, neurodevelopment, and synaptic refinement. But everybody who struggles with addiction started sometime while the brain was developing. Now, I'm not saying 11-year-olds are shooting heroin. What I'm saying is that 11, 12, 14-year-olds start with something, whether it's alcohol, marijuana, or cigarettes. Those are the three most common ones in our society that our kids start with. And when you talk to somebody struggling with addiction and you say, when did you start? The answer is 12, 13, 14, or 15. Every now and then, this week I had some guy tell me he was 18. That was an unusual answer. And sometime, I'm going to go back and ask him again, because usually I get a story that sounds a little different. When I've asked that question at the jail, because I give this talk to my inmates, I'm the medical director at a local jail, so I'll have 100 men in the room, all of whom are there for addiction. I'll say, first age of first use, nicotine, alcohol, or marijuana. And I'll start at 12. Every hand is up at 12. Everyone. 11, 10, 9, 8, hands are dropping, 7, 6. I have hands in the air at 6 years old in that group of people. First graders. Which seems unbelievable, but it isn't unbelievable, right? Access to nicotine, parents who possibly provide alcohol or nicotine because they somehow think it's funny to their 6-year-old. And back in the day, think about how much our parents smoked. I mean, these days parents don't smoke cigarettes as much, but packs of cigarettes are just lying around. You used to be able to walk into a store and buy a pack for your mom, right? Does anybody remember those days? You could never do that now, right? Public policy has changed, but people of my generation, that was fairly normal. Okay, so again, early use is the one thing our kids get to control for, and what I said to them today is postpone your use. Just postpone it. If you could postpone exposure to 21, you almost have canceled out all your genetic risk. So our kids who have strong genetic risk, that's specifically what I tell them. I tell that to my own personal children at home, but I tell it to the kids I take care of in my practice. When you look at kids who start drinking at the age of 15, and drinking here is defined as 2 drinks a week, 2 alcoholic beverages a week, not tons, that's it. 40% of those 15-year-olds go on to be alcoholics. If you can wait till the age of 21, 7% go on. So that's well below the average. On average in this country, about 10% of us struggle with alcohol use. So if our kids can hear that, look, I'm not saying you're never going to drink, don't ever drink, it's going to kill you, because that's not realistic, right? But all I ask my own kids to do, or the kids I talk to, is postpone use. I never say to my kids, postpone your use of nicotine products, because I don't ever want my kids to smoke, right? And they always laugh, because these days, kids often think people smoking cigarettes should be arrested, because they're so horrified by it, right? They should not be arrested. I am not promoting the arresting of anyone for addiction. Okay, so this is what we know. Cigarette smoke is the lowest it's ever been in history. People are really not smoking, either adults are starting to quit, but also our high school seniors are smoking at the lowest rates in history. That's a remarkable thing. Marijuana use is up. Oops. And marijuana use is up a lot. And the reason is there's this really strong decreased perception of harm. And I can tell you, not all 1,200 of those kids believe this. I just said this to the principal, but the chasm between the belief that there's no harm in marijuana, in fact, marijuana is a health drug, it's good for you, it's natural, there's no harm coming from it. The chasm between the 25s and younger and the rest of us is pretty broad. We saw it demonstrated this morning, but I'm always struck by how broad it is. And I want to dive in on what that looks like. So this is what we showed to the students today, but brain stuff that's happening between the ages of 12 and 24, there's 3 specific things. One is synaptic refinement, which is pruning back some of the tens of billions of synapses in your brain. Nobody needs that many synapses. It does not make you smarter to have more synapses. It actually is bad for the brain to have too many. It's disorganized. So what happens in teenage years is they are getting rid of stuff they don't need. Right? That's a good thing. You want to lose some of these connections in the brain, and you want them to hold on to the synapses that are useful, right? So this is why this brain development in the teenage years is so critical, and why sitting on a sofa playing a video game 24/7 is not so good for the developing brain. The second thing that happens during this time is the myelination, or the insulating of pathways for efficiency. So again, it's about building pathways in the brain that you want to hold on to long term. It's sort of going from a crazy, chaotic brain to a very highly organized highway system. And the third and final thing that happens during this phase is the laying down of receptors in the brain. And there's 2 receptors that get laid down in that outer cortex, that outer shell of the brain. One is dopamine. We just talked about dopamine. That's when it gets laid down. right? Critical time. And the second thing is a receptor called anandamide. And anandamide is the receptor that decides what synapses go and which ones stay. It's critical. It's really important. Who's ever heard of that receptor? I hadn't until like 2 years ago. I can tell you, I didn't learn about this in medical school. It just got named maybe 15 years ago. The problem with anandamide, it is a mirror image to THC, which is the psychoactive cannabinoid in marijuana. THC specifically boots anandamide out of its receptor because it's a sledgehammer instead of a scalpel. That's the way THC interacts during this phase of brain development. So THC in a developing brain is not good for a developing brain. I can say that with a tremendous amount of confidence. I'm not going to say when you're 35 and you're sitting at home alone or whatever and using marijuana that I think it's going to hurt you. I don't think you should go on a car ride or operate on my knee, but I think that is not any worse than alcohol. But in a developing brain, I actually think it is quite a damaging drug. These are all of those pink things are places where anandamide and THC settle, and those are the last parts of brain development. And one of the things I said to the students is part of our big problem in this country is we don't study the effects of marijuana. Why don't we study the effects of marijuana? Because it's a Schedule I drug, right? Smarty Pants is over there, okay? So it's a Schedule I drug, meaning it's illegal to study it with federal dollars. The only marijuana you can study is the stuff that's grown at the University of Mississippi that's been growing there since 1972. I guarantee you that is not even closely resembling any marijuana that anybody's now using. So studying that would be ridiculous. So this is an important study that came out of Australia and New Zealand. They do a lot of really good long-term studies. It's a very well-known study called the Dunedin Study. And they followed people over a period of 25 years. Kids who started using marijuana at 13, 15, and 17 versus kids who never used marijuana. And it followed them up until the age of 38 and said, hey, do those two contingents look like each other? And what it showed is an 8-point drop in IQ for those who used marijuana as teenagers. They didn't even have to continue use. Some did, but they didn't have to continue to have lost 8 points in IQ. And more important than just IQ, from my perspective, is the people who started marijuana early had a much stronger sense of, I didn't get to be or do what I wanted to do on this planet. A high dissatisfaction with life score at the age of 38 because they just didn't get to where they needed to go. There were lower rates, so this is just showing the drop in IQ, but lower rates of graduating from high school, that were all statistically significant, and lower rates of entering university. So again, a fairly well-regarded study. It followed, 1,023 people for 25 years. The problem is that study was done on the marijuana from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which, by the way, is nothing like the marijuana we have today in 2016. So prior to the early 1990s, the THC level in marijuana products ranged between 1% and 2.5%. So the psychoactive cannabinoid that we all recognize is THC. There are hundreds and hundreds of different cannabinoids in a marijuana plant, but they ranged between 1 to 2.5% back in the day, which wasn't so long ago. It was when I was in medical school. Now, when the DEA confiscates a marijuana plant, they test it for the THC. And every field-grown plant out there is now ranging between 9% and 16%, and it's only going to get more and more potent because they're intentionally trying to grow a more potent product. And somebody asked me about the CBD, which is the hallucinogen psychoactive drug, the one that actually does help with nausea or muscle spasm. You can see that's flat, right? Nobody out there is growing plants that have better CBDs in them, not what's getting confiscated. So this is what marijuana looks like, the kind of marijuana that our kids can be exposed to. And I actually think that most adults in this room have no idea even what you would do with this stuff, right? I mean, like, some of it looks kind of gross. The one that's called earwax, I'm always like, ugh, that's just disgusting sounding. But so you can take a marijuana plant and you can chemically alter it with butane. You can force the THC out of it in a variety of ways. You can be left with a cannabinoid oil, a hash oil, butter, shatter, earwax. These range between 40 and 100% THC. So if you think that study that looked at an 8-point drop in IQ based on THC levels of 2.5%, if you think using a product that's 40 to 100% THC is going to boost your IQ, you think we're not going to lose a generation or two of our kids, some portion of them, to becoming sort of couch potato chip eating, non-getting where they meant to go? Like, these are the people who are taking care of me in my old age. I'm not really gung-ho on this concept. So lots of different ways to consume marijuana. It's not just rolling up some dried weed and some paper and smoking it. And in fact, when parents have found stuff in their kids' room and they've texted me pictures, I'm like, yeah, no, I know what that is. I know you have no idea what that is. But that is a way of heating marijuana and getting the vapor into your lungs. And it's stuff that most of us in this room would think, this looks like some crazy chemistry experiment. But I can tell you, your kids know, and how do they know? They know because of this thing called the internet. And if you go on the internet is the source of all information for everybody under the age of 30. And they will tell you on the internet that everything about marijuana is positive and good. That's what you will find on the internet. So lots of different ways to eat it, to spray it, to heat it up. This is what is available for sale at the stores in Colorado. So lookalikes to candy bars, gummy bears, licorice sticks, lollipops. And has anybody been to Colorado? Have you been recently during the time? And did you see any marijuana stores?
Yeah, you know, I don't know, like the house.
They're everywhere, right?
Yeah.
There's more marijuana stores than there are Starbucks. They're everywhere. And there's no judgment here, but if I went to Colorado, and in fact I may make a trip, I'm just going to go, and I want to walk in the stores because I want to see how they look. So when I talk to people who've gone, they're like, this is what you see. There's candy everywhere, right? They're on the outside of the store are like cartoon characters offering things for free. Now, my point here is that this is targeted to our children, right? Part of the industry of big marijuana is part of their business model is they need to get addicted as many teenagers as possible in order to keep this going, right? That's the 80-year-old lady who has cancer is not going to be fueling that industry, right? That's not their market, their target audience. Their target audience is our kids. And it's this kind of thing that gets our kids excited. Now, when I showed this slide, this place was in an uproar. They were pumped about this concept, right? And they weren't really. I just think it was sort of, it's an uncomfortable conversation to have me standing here talking about things that they think are fine, and here we are having a hard conversation about the ways in which maybe it isn't fine. It's a complicated discussion. But when you're selling kids Kit Kats and gummy bears and Butterfingers, right? This is intended for the use of our kids. There's no way around it. And there's nothing about the ballot on November 8th that's going to protect us necessarily from this. So, big marijuana. In the year 1900, less than 1% of Americans smoked nicotine products, smoked cigarettes. But that is the year that big tobacco took over. And big tobacco, R.G. Reynolds and all the big companies began to grow a plant that had more nicotine in it, right? Nicotine is in the leaf of the tobacco plant, and they began to grow intentionally plants that had more nicotine so they could addict more people. Sound familiar? They secondly began to shape it into forms like a paper-rolled cigarette with a whole bunch of additives to make it even more intense and addictive, right? So by the year 1950, nearly 70% of men in this country were smoking cigarettes. That is what big tobacco did to an original plant of Native America that our native people were using very infrequently. So we took a plant that grew out of the ground, made it very addictive, and got a whole bunch of our country addicted, and again, it remains the #1 killer in this country. And the notion that big marijuana is coming and doing this exact same thing, we've learned our lesson from tobacco. The notion 30 years from now, we're going to look back at where we were and think, what were we thinking? How did we let this one get out of the barn? If I could guarantee that nobody under the age of 25 was going to use marijuana, I would be fine with it. Because I already said to you, you can't get addicted to something, or almost never will you get addicted if you haven't exposed yourself to the substance prior to the age of 25, right? And instead, when you look at the rates of teenagers using marijuana in Colorado, the national average is 16%. In a 2-year span of time, it went to nearly 40% in Colorado. So the availability of the product on the market, it went into the hands of our teenagers. That is the thing I do not want to have happen. And nobody can convince me it's not going to go that way, because that is how we see it going. Okay, switching topics, back to cigarettes, right? Use of cigarettes, way down. The use of something is way up. Not marijuana here, though. Vaping, right? Vaping. And the use of vaping products in this community, and I think in this region in general, is pretty high. I don't know what the story is, but you guys have a lot of people selling vaped products, and I think there's a little bit more, possibly, community acceptance of vaped products. So Obama has the order of the government to regulate this, but it hasn't gone into effect. So this is a 100% unregulated industry. Most 65% of high school seniors will say they have vaped something in the past, and they'll say, I only vape flavored products. The truth is they have no idea what they're vaping, because we have no idea what they're vaping. There's nobody regulating this stuff. It's coming out of China. Personally, I don't believe I should be ingesting or inhaling anything from China, right? There's nobody who's making sure that that product is safe. It has formaldehyde in it. Formaldehyde is the thing we're like pickling frogs with in biology. The notion of inhaling formaldehyde into your beautiful pink lungs also seems like a bad idea to me. I am not in favor of vaped products. The things that looked just flavored can often have nicotine in them, which meant I just took a 17-year-old who thinks she's vaping, cotton candy flavor, and now she's addicted to nicotine. How did I help public health that way? Here I am, we've made this great public shift away from nicotine, and now we're getting kids addicted again. So I'm not so gung-ho on the vaped products. I'm going to skip this one for a second. Okay, alcohol. Let's dive in on alcohol. Big breath. I need to drink water for a second. Okay, so 1/3 of us in this country drink absolutely zero, nothing. 1/3 of us in this country drink a little bit. And here I'm reflecting on adults, not on kids. And a little bit here is defined as a couple drinks a month, maybe a drink a week, light social drinkers. And the final 1/3 of us drink all the rest of the alcohol. And in fact, the final 10% of us, on average, drink 10 drinks a day. Now that seems like a lot of alcohol, and most people don't believe me on that one, but I just want us to pause and ask, what does it mean to drink alcohol? So a unit of alcohol is a beer, right? No one's going to argue a 12-ounce beer is one drink. When it comes to hard alcohol, it's 1.5 ounces. So unless you're accurately measuring your cocktail at home or your gin and tonic, I know most people don't. Most people are really pouring in 2 or 3 equivalents of alcohol into that mixed drink. So you can easily get to 3. And when anybody comes to my office, I ask the question, tell me about your relationship to alcohol. And sometimes they say, I don't drink at all, I've never drunk, and I explore that with them. But a lot of times, and particularly women, they'll say to me, oh, I have a couple glasses at night. And I say, what are you drinking? And they'll say, wine. And I'm like, tell me about the size of the serving you're giving yourself. Because a beverage level of wine is 5 ounces. 5 ounces. And I know the size of the drinks and the glasses and goblets and giant mason jars on a stem that many of us have at home. And I say to my women in my office, I say, I need you to put 5 ounces in your wine glass and acknowledge that's a drink. Just acknowledge that's one drink. And I'm not shaming and blaming you. I just need you to be aware that when you pour yourself your glug, glug, glug glass of wine every night, you're pouring yourself 3 glasses of wine. And when you tell me you drink a couple, you're really drinking 6, 7, or 8. And when they say a couple to me, they don't mean a couple, they mean more than that. It is very easy to get to 8 to 10 glasses of something a day and not mean to. Women are specifically being targeted with alcohol these days, right? It is very unusual to go out with your friends and not drink, right? They are intentionally marketing to the stressed out, overworked mom out there, right? I know a lot of us in this room work full time. We've been up since 5. We walked the dog. We started the laundry. I did all that yesterday, and I snaked my toilet before 6 in the morning yesterday, and I was like, are you kidding me? Is this really what I am doing right now? But yet, that is what we do. And after a long day of work, you come home and you're like, oh my God, the house has been trashed. The breakfast dishes aren't in the dishwasher. Nobody walked the dog. Nobody did their homework. And women glug, 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 glug their wine because they're trying to shift their mood. They're trying to decrease their stress. They're trying to sleep better. They're trying to change what is happening. And so what I will say to everybody in this room, whether you're a man or a woman, is you've got to think about what kind of role model you want to be for your kids. And when you come in the house after a terrible day at work and you're exhausted, and what they see you do is flip off the top of a beer bottle or pour yourself the giant mason jar full of wine. You're modeling, when I'm stressed out and overwhelmed, I drink. And if every one of us walked in after a hard day and said, wow, I've had a hard day, anybody want to go on a walk with me? I've had a terrible day and I hate my job. I'm going to go turn on my 10-minute meditation app on my phone, and I'm going to go lie down in the other room, and I'm going to quiet down my brain. I'm going to go stand in tree pose in the corner. If we could model for our kids healthy responses to stress, as opposed to just drinking too much. Because a lot of us, including a lot of us in this room, are drinking too much alcohol. Okay. I said there were 3 things that predisposed you to addiction. I talked about early use. I talked about genetics. The third one is a history of childhood trauma. I didn't talk about this one with the kids today because it's complicated, but a study came out in 2007 that came from Kaiser, and in this study, they asked 10 questions of adults reflecting on their lives under the age of 18. And the way the study was designed, they were trying to suss out whether a childhood history of trauma affects who's going to struggle with a lifetime of obesity. That was the reason they ran this study. And instead, they found a different answer than they anticipated. I'm not going to read the whole study, but nobody can read this. I want you to know what these questions were, just so you understand it, okay? Did a parent or another adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically harmed? Did a parent or another adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that there were marks? Were you ever sexually abused? Did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or that your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other? Did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you, or that your parents were too high or too drunk to take you to the doctor if you needed? Were your parents separated or divorced? Was there somebody in your household with major mental illness? Was there somebody in your household who was incarcerated? 10 questions asked to an adult over the age of 18 about what might have happened to them under the age of 18. What the study showed is a measure of household dysfunction, neglect, and abuse. And it was a predictor, and a significant predictor of every chronic disease out there. If you scored a 3 or a 4 on an ACE study, that's called the ACE study, you were more likely to die earlier. You were more likely to have a heart attack earlier. You were more likely to have emphysema or COPD. You were more likely to have asthma. You were more likely to have multiple broken bones. You were more likely to have more than 30 sexual partners, which is not a good health choice. It is a predictor of every chronic disease out there with the exception of diabetes and strokes. But everything else could be predicted by this. And that seems crazy. Like, what does having a bad childhood have to do with chronic disease? But when you really dive back into it, it actually makes sense because we all learn coping techniques as kids to help us survive the terror that some of our kids live through. 25% of our kids in this country score a 3 or higher on the ACE score. That's a high number. And the numbers in Easton are probably average. I've been to communities where I've seen their ACE scores because they do them, and they're above average. And you know, knowing what a kid's ACE score is in a classroom is not, again, this is not a survey we do to kids, but kids in a classroom act different when their trauma levels are high. And when I've given this talk to teachers, I actually spent a lot of time talking about childhood trauma, how to really treat it, and what those kids look like in the classroom. The 2 diseases that were most highly predicted for were these 2 diseases. One is chronic pain, struggling with the disease of chronic pain, and the second one was addiction. If you scored a 3 or a 4 on this study, you had a very high chance of becoming addicted because nothing will numb you up to the pain of your life, of feeling what you felt. Nothing will numb you up faster than drugs or alcohol. So, genetics, trauma, and early use. And my message to parents or people that love kids is delay use as long as you can and talk to your kids. Talk early, talk often. 5th grade is certainly, by 5th grade you should be talking to your kids. We talked about the fact kids are starting drugs and alcohol 10, 11, 12, 13. The average age of marijuana use in Massachusetts is 12.8. That's not a good thing. This is not a positive movement. Okay, so let's talk about opiates. Everybody thinks I'm going to be here talking about opiates, and I just spent really a long talk not talking about opiates, although opiates consume a big chunk of my life these days. Every morning I get up and I read the obituaries. I read them somewhat obsessively. I get up, I sometimes walk the dog and read the obituaries. with my little flash headlamp on. And I read the obituaries because I'm a family physician. I take care of a lot of old people, some of whom died last night. And I need to know who they are. I have to call families. I need to fill out a death certificate. And also I just want to know how people are. And in December of 2012, I opened up the paper and I read the obituary of Ashley Sims, who was the young woman in the red jacket on this picture. And it read, Ashley Sims, age 21, died of a heroin overdose at home. And I thought, oh my God, I know Ashley and I know her grandmothers who raised her. And I called them to express my shock and my sadness, and also to thank them for telling the truth about how Ashley died. Because it was the very beginning of us beginning to acknowledge what was happening in our communities. That for a couple years I'd been reading obituaries of unexpected deaths at home of young people. And really, there's two major reasons people will die unexpectedly at home: suicide or overdose. Unless it says at the bottom, please give money to the Dana-Farber or Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. But the truth is, most of the time we knew about those, right? We knew somebody had cancer and was sick. The other ones were surprises. So our little local paper, these grandmothers went to our local paper and said, please don't let Ashley's death go in vain. We need you to tell the story about what's happening in our community. It's affecting the courts, it's affecting DCF, it's affecting the jails, it's affecting everything. And there's no doubt in my mind that pills are absolutely on the hook for this epidemic. Like this, we did not get to where we are in 2016 were it not for the overprescribing of opiates from the years 1996 until now. I think the problem has really shifted a different way in the last couple years, and you'll hear me say that I'm a big believer in decreasing the number of prescription opiates on the planet without a doubt. I also believe that most people with chronic pain can get benefit from opiates and they are not addicted to their meds. Now, I can say both those things can be true because this is a complicated issue. But when I have elected officials patting themselves on the back about how we've curtailed prescription drugs aren't my problem anymore, right? I have kids whose first drug out of the barn at the age of 16 is actually heroin, right? Heroin costs nothing in my community, and I think it doesn't cost much around here either. Now, most of our kids are not using heroin. In fact, most of our kids are not using opiates. But something starts to go awry for them at the age of 18, 19, and 20, and if they had a predisposition to this, right, early use, whether it was marijuana, nicotine, or alcohol, they often then jump to something else. It gets handed to them. They think, I can handle it, I'll be fine. And what they don't realize is the way that drug works in the brain, very few people have nice, healthy, recreational use of heroin. It does not exist. People find themselves sliding down that very steep slope rapidly. So the more we prescribed opiates, the more people entered treatment for opiate addiction, and that black line is the more people died of opiate overdose. I like this slide because it puts this in context of public health recently. So from the year 2000 to the year 2010, it's a complicated public health slide, but those negative bar graphs on the bottom is where we reduced death. And the number one reduction in death was due to aortic aneurysm rupture. We had a 34% decrease in the rupture of aortic aneurysms in that 10-year span. Does anybody know why? People want to say it's the surgery's better, or we detected faster, we did an ultrasound. It's none of those things. It's because smoking is down. When you stop smoking, you're less likely to have a rupture. So public health measures, smoking went down, that went down. Why is death by flu and pneumonia lower? Vaccines. Why is death in motor vehicles lower? Seatbelts and safer cars, exactly. So a handful of places we saved lives and fewer people have died. And then everything up top in the positive margin are places where increased rates of death have happened. Now, when you look at it, there appears to be an epidemic of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and end-stage renal disease, right? Is there really an epidemic in those things? We live forever. Right? Like forever and ever. And eventually, when you are 102 and I'm filling out your death certificate, I write down Alzheimer's. Because for the last 15 years, you didn't know who I was, right? And I got to write something on the death certificate. So there's not an epidemic of these things. It's just that some of us will never, ever die. Now, what is positive on this list are two things. And that is suicides are up. And that top line is a 276% increase in death by opiate overdose. Now this data comes before 2010, right? This is true prescription opiate death. This bar would go all the way off the stage by today's analysis because of the number of people who are dying of death by heroin and fentanyl. We're losing 79 people every day in this country due to this. So again, that bar, public health measure, compared to all other diseases, would go off the stage. One of the reasons I do this work is because I am a doctor who prescribes opiates, and I prescribed opiates in the 1990s, in the very beginning of this epidemic, and I feel personally responsible for it. Even though I'm not, I feel it. I go out, I train doctors, I retrain doctors, I give talks like this to doctors. It's one of the reasons I feel so passionate, and I'm so ticked off that so few clinicians are rising to the challenge of helping people who have addiction, because a lot of us created the problem, yet we're not there with a solution, and that feels inexcusable to me. When you look at the country, that top map is mainly blue. Those red areas are places where people are dying of death by overdose. And what you see in the year 2000 is you start to see on that top map, you can see Appalachia start to light up. You can see parts of northern New Mexico start to light up. Northern New Mexico, there's a Native American area in that region that has historically generations of addiction. That's been known to public health for a while. That's why you see that there. 5 years go by and you start to see in that middle map a lot of the state, a lot of the country turning red, right? The Appalachia becomes more of like the Rust Belt. You start to see Florida and Maine light up. And then 4 or 5 more years go by, and that bottom map is the year 2008, 2009, and look how much of the country has turned red. This is before heroin even hit us. When you ask, where did this medicine all come from, I take personal responsibility for 100% of the prescribing, which I actually am a really good prescriber. But most of the opiates that came to New England came to us from Florida. So back in the bad old days, from the years 1999 to 2010, there were more than 600 pain clinics in Florida, the state of Florida, and they were pill mills where a doctor or whomever could both hand pills and prescriptions to somebody. And there was this notion of medical tourism, where you would get on a bus in Kentucky or Maine, you would get a free chartered bus with air conditioning to Florida and 3 nights stay in a hotel, and your job was to walk in to 2 or 3 pain clinics a day. You didn't need a cane, you didn't need to look old or limp. You could just say, I have migraines or fibromyalgia, and you would get a bag of pills and 3 prescriptions. And your job was to hand that back to the tour operator on the bus. You went back after having a 3-day trip to Florida without a lot of work. They sold those drugs on the streets of wherever they came from. So in 2009 and 10, the federal government looked at the state of Florida and said, you guys are a disaster, and we're going to cut off federal funding. No highway funds, no education funds, until you guys can get your act together. Then Florida shut down nearly every one of those pill mills, and 37 doctors were incarcerated because they weren't doctors, they're drug dealers. They were making tens of millions of dollars a year. I had the DEA agent who did their shutdown give a talk at a conference I was at, and he was showing pictures of their 12-car garage filled with Lamborghinis. They were criminals. The problem is when you shut down the pill mills coming from Florida, you had a whole bunch of states filled with a whole bunch of people who were addicted to pills. And what were you left with? Right. So Mexico was watching all this happen. They had mowed over their marijuana plants long ago, and they had planted poppies back about 2008. So we always think poppies and opium comes from Afghanistan. Starting after 2005, it really began to come from Mexico, and that's our source of most of our heroin in this country is Mexican heroin. And if you ask EMS workers what their #1 drug of abuse is, those dark green areas, the answer is absolutely heroin. What always surprises me living in New England is why the whole country doesn't light up, and specifically, why doesn't the Southeast light up? Anybody have any ideas? This is the answer. Those dark purple states are states where there is, on average, 1 to 1.5 bottles of opiates per person living in that state. So those dark purple states are still states where there's a tremendous amount of prescription of opiate pills still. This is recent data. So the problem is that the CDC and the FDA this year came down with new prescribing guidelines. And what will likely happen in those purple states is they too are going to get their pipeline cut off. And when you look at the country in terms of heroin use, those red states, including us, is heroin. You can see specifically those southeastern states are not looking red. But if you can imagine those dark purple states with their pill bills shut down, turning into red states. Look how much of the country becomes red with heroin. This is 100% predictable. This is just me up here talking, looking at maps. But we will have deaths in the tens of thousands, possibly even higher than that, when the Southeast gets shut down, because heroin will take over there. And if they're paying any attention, they should look at what has happened to us in the Northeast and think, oh my gosh, we need to get our doctors trained in addiction care, we need to build methadone clinics, we need to get treatment facilities up and running. And I guarantee you, that's not happening in the Southeast right now. So where do our kids get exposed to opiates? So I have a talk that actually, I think it's mandated, it's not my talk that's mandated, but a talk given to every parent and athlete has been mandated by Charlie Baker's legislation, where we talk about exposure to opiates in the athlete. And I can't remember the answer. It is something we eventually show here.
We are showing something, but I didn't get the video, the 17-minute video.
Yeah. So there's a 17-minute video that your athletes will see. So we'll go over some of this data later. So it's something that's been running around the state recently. So our kids get exposed to opiates because of an injury, right? They fracture their femur playing football, ice hockey, they have an ACL tear because they're a female soccer player, or they get their wisdom teeth out, right? Average age of wisdom tooth is between 18 and 22, college-aged kids. That is where most of our kids will be handed a prescription for an opiate, although most opiates that our kids use, and again, the rates of opiate use amongst our teenagers have never been lower. I know we're all terrified of heroin, but I want to be clear to you, in the high school, I don't think there's a lot of opiate use going on. Partly because most of us are not keeping it in our cabinets anymore. Most of us are not holding on to these bottles for a rainy day, and if you are, and they're not under lock and key, I'm going to urge you to bring them back to the drug take-back box tomorrow, because I'm sure it's across the street, right? Is the drug take-back box there? Police department, right? So if you're holding on to these bottles because you think someday you may need them, first of all, they're probably expired, probably you don't need them, and the next person that's going to get their hands on them is your 15-year-old granddaughter or your neighbor. Get them out of your house. They don't belong there. So how do we help protect our kids? This other video that we do that talks to parents about this, when you go to the dentist and you have some work done, right, a root canal or wisdom teeth, you've got to give some pushback about how many they're writing. So for those of you who've had some recent dental work, how many opiates were prescribed for you? Anybody have any dental work?
I just had surgery, and they only gave me 7 days worth, but I think it ended up being like 12 pills, and so it's fine.
So this is a shift that is happening in the last year, and I've been asking this question for 3 years of audiences, like how many were you given, right? In the early days, 3 years ago, people were like, I got 60, and you're like, oh my God, you had a root canal, you needed 60 of nothing, right? And then people would say, I got 30, and then people began to say, I got 15. But when I asked the second question, how many did you use for your wisdom tooth or your root canal? Right? I've asked tens of thousands of people this question now. People will say, I used 2 or 4 or 6 or 0. So, for oral surgery, they really should be writing for no more than 6 as far as I'm concerned. Just saying. And guess what? If something's wrong with your mouth and you need more, quite honestly, you should be evaluated. And secondly, they're doctors. They're big boys and girls who can refill a script if needed. I'm on call 24/7. We'll work it out, okay? So I love the fact that you had surgery and you were given 12 of something, and you look great, and that's healing beautifully. So pushback is my point, right? Guess what? Doctors like to do the same old, right? Sometimes my computer automatically populates 30. The other thing that doctors have got to get better at is looking at people and saying, have you ever struggled with an opiate use problem? Because it's an allergy as far as I'm concerned. If you've had a struggle in the past, you are the person who I want to prevent from launching down that steep hillside again. It doesn't mean I won't treat your pain. It means I'm going to hold you really tightly and treat your pain. Okay, so signs at home that your kid may be struggling. I'm going to just show the picture. So let me be clear about this. I'm not a helicopter parent. If anything, I'm a bit of the neglectful parent, right? My kids, right? These guys know this in the front row, but my girls are, I have a 7th grader, a 9th grader, and I have a high school kid. But my girls are home alone, and I don't do their laundry, I don't clean their room. They have a lot of responsibilities at my house, but I go into their rooms about once every 2 weeks, and I just look around for stuff that does not belong in the room. And some of that stuff is food, cereal, disgusting, rotting cereal bowls, right? That ticks me off. But I also look for the room for everything up here, okay? Including any pill. Like, I don't want any pills in my kids' room. They should not have Tylenol or Benadryl or Motrin in their room, because the average kid, in fact, the average adult, has no idea how much of those medicines to take, and they often overuse them. One of the leading causes of liver failure in teenage girls is too much Tylenol. Oh, I have period cramps, let me take more, let me take more. And before you know it, they're taking 10,000 milligrams of Tylenol, which leads to liver failure, right? No pill bottle should be in your kid's room. That's rule number 1. If I found a pill in my kid's room, 1, I would freak out. But before I freaked out, I would go to the internet and I would figure out what that pill was, because there's internet sites that show you what every pill is. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I look in the room for this stuff. Anything you could snort something through. The inside of a pen, straws, rolled up dollar bills. I know that seems stupid, that I would find personal anxiety in finding a straw in my kid's room, but I actually don't want any straws in my kid's room. I don't want them there. It is, for me, a potential sign of somebody who's snorting something. They shouldn't be eating in their room anyway, so why is there a straw in their room? So this is some of what I do. Baggies, little tiny baggies. Unless your kids are doing jewelry projects and are tiny beaters, there's no baggies in their room. If you're finding baggies, that is a red flag concern. I say this in this crazy, over-the-top mom way because I am sitting at the other end of the exam table with parents who bring in their 24-year-olds who say, my kid's in trouble, and I had no idea. And I say, we're going to help get their kid better. But I need you to go home, and I need to empty out their bedroom. I need everything out of their bedroom. Every stick of furniture, every drawer needs to be gone through. And they come back to me a week later, and they say, I found tens of thousands of these little plastic bags. And I say, I know you did. You got to get rid of that stuff. And if you guys knew it was there, you would have been able to help them earlier. Other things in a room that would cause me a lot of alarm is any burnt foil. Why is there burnt foil or burnt gum wrapper ever in your household? There should never be that. Unless you just had baked potato in a barbecue pit in the backyard, there's no burnt foil in your house. A bent spoon or a spoon with burn marks. Kids going through bags and bags of cotton balls or Q-tips because they're using it as a filter. I say this because all day I take care of parents who've been struggling, and if they had only known what to look for earlier, they could have helped their kids. My personal goal is to be the kind of mom who knows my kid is struggling within 3 months. That's my own little bar that I've set for myself. I do not want to be the parent who figured it out after 2 years. So that's the goal I hope for everybody in this room. Look around your kid's room. Make sure none of these worrisome things are in there. And if there are, just ask your kid, what's going on? Is there anything I need to worry about? How can I help you more? And I'm going to take that question. I have only one more slide, okay? 2 more slides. Narcan. If you have somebody you love in your life who you think is struggling with an opiate use problem, you need to have Narcan. You need to know how to use it. Narcan is really easy to use. You send a spray up somebody's nose. It's gotten easier and easier. You can get it without a prescription at nearly every pharmacy in Massachusetts. Is that fair to say locally? Do we have Walgreens locally? Yeah, Walgreens is the pharmacy that has done the best job rolling this out. CVS is running a little bit behind them, but without a prescription covered by your insurance, not the person struggling insurance, you can have Narcan. I keep it in my purse because I never know when I may need to use it. And anybody who needs it should have it. Our school nurses have it. Thank you very much. Even though I have a police and fire department that is like spitting distance, our school nurses, if there was a staff member or a student who overdosed in this building, they have the right medicine and they know how to help. That's an extraordinary thing. There's not many other states that can say that. That was not mandated by the state. That was school nurses taking the lead on this issue. These are books I read that sit by my bedside table, and that if you thought any of this was interesting or relevant to you or you wanted to learn more, These are awesome books to read. The book in the middle, and taking a picture with your smartphone is a good idea, but that book in the middle called The Body Keeps the Score is one of the best books on trauma I've ever read. And if anything about the trauma thing I talked about resonates with you, that is a lovely book. If you are a treatment provider, a school nurse, somebody who does mental health work, a teacher, I actually think that's a great read. But any of these books are great reads if you found this interesting. So let me, in the back question, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to stop you.
No, that's fine.
One second.
Those are down here? Yeah, those are filters. Those are actually like filters that you would, like a cigarette filter. Most people don't actually acquire those, but they do exist. So if you found anything that looked like a cigarette filter, that would be worrisome. And the other things on those pictures are like parts of a needle cap.
Yeah, and then two left, next to the foil.
Bottle cap. That's a bottle cap that you would actually cook something down in. And again, bottle caps in your kid's room, that's not that uncommon. So my point is that again, I don't clean my kid's room, but I look around for the worrisome signs. I get very yelly when I walk into my kid's room, because there's always stuff that doesn't belong in there. The one at the bottom, there's a belt, right? Okay, thank you for asking. I know the pictures, I got this from Learn to Cope, actually. Do you guys know what Learn to Cope is? It's a support group for parents or families of people struggling with an opiate addiction, and Learn to Cope was founded in Massachusetts, and they're a great organization. What other questions can I answer for people?
Can you put the slide back again with all those?
Oh yeah. And again, anybody who wants these slides, if you don't know Lynn, will you stand up? Lynn is one of our great school nurses here. She's become my friend. I said it last time, but she's so nice. And I tell you, I never talk to kids. I never come out during the day. I never come out on Tuesdays, so I don't have any coverage for my kids on Tuesdays, but I said I would do anything for this school, because I actually really think you guys are like the nicest school district I've been in. And I don't say that lightly.